Just before my daughter walked down the aisle, her maid of honor grabbed me. The groom's brother just told me he's already married to someone else. The wedding march began playing. Everyone stood and turned toward us. In one heartbreaking second, I acted. The music swelled through the chapel speakers, Pachelbel's cannon filling the ornate space where 300 guests had risen to their feet and turned expectantly toward the back of the church. My daughter Claire stood beside me in her $5,000 wedding dress, her face radiant behind the veil, her hand resting on my arm as we prepared to walk down the aisle toward the man she'd been planning to marry for the past 18 months. Olivia Barnes, Claire's best friend since college and her maid of honor, had her hand clenched around my other arm with enough force to leave marks, her face pale and her voice barely a whisper as she repeated words that made my blood run cold. David's brother just pulled me aside 30 seconds ago. He was drunk and rambling, but he said David is already married to someone in Texas. He said she doesn't know about Claire and that David's been lying to everyone. The words didn't make sense, couldn't possibly be true, but Olivia's expression showed terror and certainty in equal measure. And I had maybe 5 seconds to decide whether to let my daughter walk down that aisle into a marriage that might be fraudulent, or to stop everything right now in front of 300 witnesses and destroy what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. I'd been planning this wedding with Claire for 18 months, ever since David Reynolds had proposed to her during a weekend trip to wine country that he'd documented with professional photographs and a carefully orchestrated surprise involving her favorite restaurant and a violinist. Claire was 28, my only daughter, a successful marketing manager who'd spent her 20s building a career and waiting for the right relationship after too many disappointing attempts at dating. David had seemed perfect when she'd introduced him to me and my wife Catherine 2 years ago. He was 32, handsome and charming, worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative with a territory covering 3 states, drove a nice car and wore expensive suits, and said all the right things about his intentions toward Claire. He'd asked my permission before proposing, a traditional gesture I'd appreciated even though Claire didn't need my permission to make her own choices. He'd been respectful and appropriate, joining us for family dinners and holidays, seeming genuinely invested in becoming part of our family. The engagement had been celebrated with parties and congratulations from both families, David's parents flying in from Dallas to meet us and to start coordinating the wedding plans. His mother Linda and his father Robert were pleasant and seemed genuinely happy about the marriage, talking about how David had finally found someone worthy of him after too many failed relationships they'd worried about. His younger brother Nathan had been designated as best man, a quieter guy who worked in finance and who'd been friendly but not particularly close with our family during the engagement period. The wedding planning had been extensive and expensive, my wife and I covering most of the costs as was traditional, budgeting $38,000 for the venue, catering, photographer, flowers, music, and all the details that went into a formal church wedding with a reception at an upscale hotel ballroom. But now, standing in the vestibule of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church at 4:17 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon with the wedding march playing and 300 people waiting and Olivia's words echoing in my mind, I was processing information that suggested everything I believed about David was a lie. He's already married to someone in Texas. The specificity of the claim, the detail about Texas where David's family was from, the fact that it had come from Nathan, who as best man would presumably know his own brother's marital status, all of it suggested this wasn't a joke or a misunderstanding. But confirming it would require time I didn't have, investigation I couldn't conduct in the 30 seconds before I was expected to walk Claire down that aisle. My options were limited and terrible. Stop the wedding now based on an unverified claim from a drunk groomsman, humiliating Claire and creating a scandal in front of everyone we knew. Or proceed with the ceremony and hope the claim was false, risking that Claire would marry someone who was committing bigamy and invalidating her entire marriage. My hands were shaking as I turned to Claire, still holding Olivia's arm and feeling the weight of her urgent grip. "Sweetheart," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to pause for just a moment. There's something I need to check before we walk down that aisle." Claire's expression shifted from radiant anticipation to confusion and then concern. "Dad, what are you talking about? Everyone's waiting. The music is playing. What could possibly need to be checked right now?" I could see panic starting to form in her eyes, the fear that something was going wrong with her perfect wedding. Olivia spoke up, her voice stronger now. "Claire, Nathan just told me something about David that we need to verify before you marry him. He said David is already married to someone else. He said it's in Texas, and that she doesn't know about you. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this." Claire's face went white beneath her makeup, the color draining so fast I worried she might faint. "That's insane," she said, voice rising. "Nathan is drunk. He's been drinking since noon. This is obviously some kind of sick joke, or he's trying to sabotage the wedding because he's jealous or something. David would never, could never. He loves me. We've been together for 2 years. I would know if he was married to someone else." The denial was understandable, the desperate need to believe this was a misunderstanding rather than a fundamental betrayal. But I couldn't let her walk down that aisle without at least attempting to verify the claim. The wedding march was still playing, the pause becoming noticeable, guests starting to murmur and shift uncomfortably as they waited for us to appear. The photographer had started walking toward us looking concerned, probably thinking we'd had some logistical problem with Claire's dress or veil. I made a decision in that moment that felt like choosing between evils. I told Olivia to go tell the wedding coordinator to pause the ceremony, to make an announcement that there was a brief delay due to an equipment issue or something similar, anything to buy us 10 minutes without causing complete chaos. Olivia hesitated, looked at Claire's devastated face, then nodded and hurried toward where the coordinator stood near the sanctuary entrance. I turned back to Claire and kept my voice low but firm. I need you to trust me. If Nathan is lying or confused, we'll walk down that aisle in 10 minutes and everything will be fine. But if there's any possibility he's telling the truth, we need to know before you sign a marriage license. Where's your phone? Claire's hands were trembling as she pulled her phone from the small clutch she'd been carrying, the device looking incongruous against her elaborate wedding dress. I called my attorney, Gerald Thompson, who I'd used for business matters and estate planning for 15 years. Thompson had 23 years of legal experience and access to resources I didn't have. Gerald answered on the third ring, sounding relaxed, probably spending his Saturday afternoon enjoying the weekend. David, what's going on? I'm at Claire's wedding right now. I've got a situation and I need you to check something immediately. I need you to search marriage records in Texas for David Allen Reynolds, born May 15, 1992. I need to know if he's ever been married. The request was unusual enough that Gerald paused before responding. That's going to take more than a few minutes. Marriage records aren't all digitized and centralized. I'd need to check county by county. Do you have any idea which county? I told him I didn't, that David's family was from Dallas, so maybe start there, but that I needed an answer as fast as humanly possible because I was currently standing in a church vestibule trying to decide whether to let my daughter marry this man. Gerald's tone shifted to professional urgency. I'm on it. I'll call in some favors with colleagues in Texas who can access local databases. Give me 15 minutes, maybe 20. I told him 15 was the max I could stall, that we had 300 people in a church waiting for a ceremony that was supposed to start 5 minutes ago. I hung up and looked at Claire, who'd been listening to my end of the conversation, her face showing a terrible mixture of hope that this was all a mistake and growing fear that it might not be. The wedding march had stopped playing, replaced by uncomfortable silence, and then classical music being piped through the speakers as the coordinator tried to cover for the delay. Through the doors to the sanctuary, I could hear confused murmuring from guests, wondering what was happening. I told Claire we needed to find Nathan and get more details about his claim before we could dismiss it as drunken rambling. She nodded numbly, and we walked quickly toward the groom's preparation room, where the groomsmen had been getting ready. David wasn't there. He was presumably already at the altar waiting for Claire, but Nathan was sitting on a couch looking disheveled and definitely intoxicated, his tie loose and his face flushed. When he saw us, he stood up quickly, swaying slightly, his expression showing guilt and defiance in equal parts. I confronted him directly, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. You told Olivia that David is married to someone in Texas. Is that true, or were you making things up? Nathan's eyes filled with tears, alcohol making him emotional and less guarded than he probably would have been sober. It's true, Nathan said, words slightly slurred. Her name is Monica. They got married 5 years ago in Houston. She still lives there. David told me 2 months ago after he'd been drinking, and he made me promise not to tell anyone because he said he was going to handle it, that he was going to file for divorce before the wedding. But I asked him last week if he'd done it, and he said he was still working on it. I got drunk today because I couldn't handle watching him marry Claire when I know he's still legally married to Monica. I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I should have told someone. But he's my brother, and I thought he'd do the right thing. The confession poured out of Nathan, guilt and alcohol combining to destroy whatever loyalty had kept him quiet. Claire made a sound like she'd been physically struck, her hand going to her mouth, tears starting to stream down her face and ruin the makeup that had taken 2 hours to apply. I asked Nathan if he had any proof, any evidence beyond his word that could confirm this Monica existed and was married to David. Nathan fumbled with his phone, scrolling through messages with clumsy fingers, and finally showed me a text exchange with David from 2 months ago. The texts were damning. David talking about the problem of being married to Monica and needing to expedite a divorce before the wedding to Claire, Nathan responding with concerns about the timing and the ethics of the situation. There were also photographs on Nathan's phone, pictures from what appeared to be David's first wedding, showing David in a tuxedo standing beside a woman in a wedding dress in front of what looked like a courthouse or small chapel. The photos were date-stamped from 5 years ago, the location data showing Houston, Texas. The evidence wasn't conclusive legally, but it was compelling enough to make my decision clear. I told Claire we weren't proceeding with the wedding until we'd verified Nathan's claims and understood what we were dealing with. She was crying harder now, her dream wedding dissolving in real time, but she nodded agreement. I need to talk to David, she said, voice breaking. I need to hear him say it's not true. Or if it is true, I need to hear why he lied to me for 2 years. We walked back toward the sanctuary, Claire still in her wedding dress that now felt like a costume for a performance that had been canceled. I asked Olivia to bring David to the vestibule to tell him there was an emergency that required his immediate attention. She returned 3 minutes later with David in tow, his expression shifting from concerned to confused to wary as he saw Claire's tear-stained face and my obvious anger. David immediately went into damage control mode, asking what was wrong, what had happened, why wasn't the ceremony starting. Before I could speak, Claire confronted him directly. Are you married to someone else? Is there a woman named Monica in Texas that you're still legally married to? David's face went through micro-expressions so fast they were almost subliminal: shock and calculation and fear and finally resignation. The silence that followed was answer enough, but David tried anyway. I can explain. It's complicated. I was young when I married Monica. It was a mistake. We've been separated for years. I meant to file for divorce before now, but it got complicated, and I thought I had more time. The explanations came out rushed and defensive, confirming the worst possible version of Nathan's story. David hadn't just been married before. He was still married now, making any marriage to Claire invalid and making him guilty of attempted bigamy. Claire's response was immediate and visceral. She pulled off her engagement ring and threw it at David, the diamond-encrusted band bouncing off his chest and falling to the floor. You were going to marry me while you're still married to someone else. You were going to commit bigamy, and you lied to me for 2 entire years. How could you? When were you going to tell me the truth? Were you ever going to tell me, or were you just going to let me find out when our marriage got invalidated? David tried to approach her, hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. I love you, he said. I was handling it. I just needed a little more time. The divorce would have been finalized soon, and then everything would have been fine. The rationalization was pathetic, the idea that committing bigamy would have been fine if only he'd managed to hide it long enough to complete the fraud. I stepped between them, protective instincts overriding everything else. You're not marrying my daughter today or any day. You lied to her, you lied to all of us, and you were about to commit a crime. Get out of this church right now before I call the police and have you arrested for attempted fraud. David's expression hardened, the mask of the charming boyfriend falling away to reveal something uglier underneath. You can't prove anything. Nathan's drunk and unreliable. I'll deny everything. You'll be the ones who look crazy for canceling a wedding over rumors. The threat was toothless, but it showed his character, more concerned with managing his image than with the harm he'd caused. My phone rang at that moment, Gerald Thompson calling back with results from his search. I answered and listened to Gerald's findings, my expression showing Claire that the news wasn't good. Gerald had connected with colleagues in Texas who'd searched marriage records in Harris County, which included Houston. They'd found a marriage license for David Allen Reynolds and Monica Patricia Garrett, dated 5 years ago, filed with the county clerk, and showing no subsequent divorce decree on record. David was definitely still legally married to Monica according to Texas state records, making any marriage to Claire invalid and potentially criminal depending on David's intent and knowledge. Gerald said he could provide certified copies of the marriage record within a few days, official documentation that would prove the marriage existed. He also mentioned that if David went through with the wedding ceremony knowing he was already married, he could potentially be charged with bigamy, which was a felony in most states, including ours, carrying potential prison time. I hung up and turned to David, my voice cold and controlled despite the rage making my hands shake. That was my attorney. He's confirmed through Texas state records that you're still married to Monica Garrett. There's no divorce on file, which means marrying Claire today would be bigamy, which is a felony. So I'm going to say this one more time. Get out of this church now, or I'm calling the police and having you arrested for attempted fraud and for wasting 300 people's time and my $38,000 in wedding expenses. David's facade crumbled completely, his face showing panic as he realized the legal implications of what he'd attempted. He tried one more appeal to Claire, saying he loved her and that this was all a misunderstanding, but she turned away from him, her shoulders shaking with sobs. David finally left, walking quickly toward the side exit, abandoning his own wedding and the 300 guests who'd come to celebrate his marriage. The next hour was a blur of difficult conversations and logistical coordination. I had to tell the wedding coordinator that the ceremony was canceled, that David had been revealed to be already married to someone else. The coordinator was professional but clearly shocked, having never dealt with a situation quite like this in her 15 years of wedding planning. She helped me coordinate an announcement to the guests, explaining that there had been a personal emergency and the wedding would not be proceeding as planned, thanking everyone for coming and asking them to enjoy the reception food and drinks that had already been paid for as a consolation for their wasted time. The announcement caused immediate chaos, 300 people erupting in shocked conversation and speculation, some leaving immediately, while others stayed to gossip and try to understand what had happened. I also had to deal with David's parents, Linda and Robert, who were mortified and angry when I told them what their son had done. Linda immediately called David, screaming into the phone about how he'd embarrassed the family and committed fraud. Robert pulled me aside and apologized profusely, saying they'd had no idea David was still married, that he'd told them he'd divorced Monica years ago after a brief failed marriage. The conversation was awkward and tense, two families who'd been preparing to unite now dealing with the destruction of all those plans and the revelation that one family's son was a liar and potential criminal. I told them I'd be pursuing legal action to recover the wedding expenses, that David's fraud had cost my family significant money and emotional harm. Claire was devastated in ways I'd never seen my daughter hurt before. Her wedding day transformed from celebration into public humiliation. Catherine, my wife, stayed with Claire while I handled the logistical chaos, holding our daughter while she cried and helping her get out of the wedding dress that now represented betrayal rather than promise. Olivia and the other bridesmaids rallied around Claire, providing support and expressing fury at David for what he'd done. The photographer we'd hired tried to be helpful, offering to delete all the pre-ceremony photos to avoid painful reminders, but I told him to keep everything as documentation for potential legal proceedings. Evidence mattered, and we were going to need all the evidence we could gather to pursue David for the harm he'd caused. Over the next week, I worked with Gerald Thompson to build a comprehensive case against David. We documented everything: the wedding expenses totaling $38,214, the marriage record from Texas proving David was already married, the text messages from Nathan about David's acknowledgement of the problem, witness statements from Olivia and others about David's deception. We also contacted Monica in Texas, tracking her down through the marriage records and calling her to inform her that her husband had been attempting to commit bigamy. Monica was shocked and furious, saying she and David had been separated for 3 years, but that he'd refused to finalize the divorce despite her repeated requests, claiming he needed more time to organize finances. She hadn't known he was engaged to someone else or that he'd been planning to marry while still legally bound to her. Monica agreed to provide a statement to support our case, and she also agreed to finally push forward with the divorce proceedings she'd been trying to complete. She hired an attorney in Texas and filed for divorce immediately, disgusted by David's behavior and wanting to permanently sever all ties. Her attorney coordinated with Gerald, sharing documentation and evidence that would support both the divorce case and our potential civil suit against David for fraud and emotional distress. The case against David grew stronger with each piece of evidence we gathered, building toward legal consequences that would hold him accountable for his actions. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I also filed a formal complaint with the police, documenting David's attempted bigamy and requesting they investigate whether criminal charges were appropriate. Detective Raymond Costa, a 19-year veteran specializing in fraud and white-collar crime, took the case and conducted interviews with everyone involved. Costa was thorough and professional, documenting the timeline of David's deception and the evidence proving his intent to commit bigamy. After 2 weeks of investigation, Costa presented the case to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for prosecution. The DA, a woman named Beverly Sinclair with 22 years of experience prosecuting fraud cases, decided to file criminal charges against David for attempted bigamy, citing the clear evidence of his knowledge and intent. David was arrested 3 weeks after the failed wedding, taken into custody at his apartment, and charged with a felony that carried potential prison time of up to 5 years. His arraignment was brief, his attorney trying to argue that David had intended to get divorced before the wedding but had simply run out of time, that there was no criminal intent. But the evidence of his text messages with Nathan, his admission to me in the church vestibule, and Monica's statement about his refusal to finalize the divorce all contradicted that claim. The judge set bail at $50,000 and scheduled a preliminary hearing to determine whether the case would proceed to trial. David made bail, but was required to surrender his passport and stay within the state pending resolution of the charges. The civil suit we filed sought recovery of all wedding expenses, plus additional damages for emotional distress and fraud. Gerald argued that David had entered into the wedding planning with knowledge that he couldn't legally marry Claire, that his continued deception even as the wedding approached constituted fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. David's attorney tried to argue that wedding expenses were a gift and couldn't be recovered, that emotional distress damages were excessive, but Gerald countered with extensive documentation of the harm David's actions had caused. Claire had required therapy to process the betrayal and public humiliation, sessions with Dr. Patricia Winslow, a psychologist specializing in relationship trauma with 16 years of clinical experience. Dr. Winslow provided expert testimony about the psychological impact of Claire's experience, the trust violations, and the trauma of having her wedding canceled minutes before walking down the aisle. The criminal case proceeded to trial 6 months after David's arrest, the prosecution presenting a methodical case built on documentary evidence and witness testimony. Monica testified about their marriage and David's refusal to finalize the divorce despite separation. Nathan testified about David's admission of the problem and his promises to handle it before the wedding. I testified about the events in the church vestibule, about David's admission that he was still married. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on charges of attempted bigamy, finding that David had knowingly attempted to marry Claire while still legally married to Monica. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months, calling his actions a calculated fraud that had caused significant harm to multiple victims. The civil suit settled before trial, David's attorney recognizing that the criminal conviction made defending against civil claims nearly impossible. David agreed to pay full restitution of the wedding expenses, plus an additional $25,000 for emotional distress, the payments to be structured over 5 years with interest. His wages would be garnished to ensure compliance, and the judgment would follow him even through bankruptcy if he tried to discharge the debt. The settlement also required David to send a written apology to Claire acknowledging his deception and the harm he'd caused, a symbolic acknowledgement that Gerald insisted on as part of any agreement. David's letter was brief and formal, written by his attorney, but it officially acknowledged his fraud and apologized for the damage to Claire's trust and well-being. The aftermath of the canceled wedding was painful and complicated for Claire, in ways that extended far beyond the immediate humiliation. She struggled with trust in relationships, with believing anything men told her, with processing the betrayal by someone she'd planned to spend her life with. The therapy with Dr. Winslow helped, giving her tools to work through the trauma and eventually rebuild her sense of self-worth, separate from David's validation. She took time away from dating, focusing on her career and her friendships, gradually healing from wounds that had cut deeper than any of us initially recognized. The public nature of the scandal made it worse, our extended family and social circle all knowing about the canceled wedding and speculating about the details, some people offering support, while others engaged in gossip that made Claire's healing more difficult. But there was also unexpected healing and growth. Claire's experience became a story she eventually shared to help other women avoid similar situations, warning about red flags in relationships and the importance of verification before making permanent commitments. She became involved with organizations that helped women escape fraudulent or abusive relationships, using her experience to provide practical advice about protecting yourself legally and emotionally. The trauma that had nearly destroyed her became, over time, a source of strength and purpose. She helped other women conduct background checks on partners, verify marital status, recognize patterns of deception. Her pain had meaning beyond just her own suffering. 2 years after the canceled wedding, Claire met someone new, a man named Thomas Garrett, who'd been divorced for 3 years, and who approached relationships with transparency and respect that felt revolutionary after David's deception. Thomas was patient with Claire's trust issues, understood her need to verify everything he told her, supported her healing process without taking her caution personally. When Thomas proposed 18 months into their relationship, I did extensive background checks, hired a private investigator to verify he'd never been married except to his documented ex-wife, checked court records to confirm the divorce was final and legitimate. I wasn't taking any chances with my daughter's happiness again. Everything checked out. Thomas was exactly who he claimed to be, a divorced father of one who'd made mistakes in his first marriage, but who'd learned from them and was ready to build something better. Claire and Thomas's wedding was small and private, 20 people at a casual outdoor ceremony that felt authentic in ways the elaborate church wedding never could have. I walked Claire down a garden path instead of a church aisle, gave her away to a man I'd thoroughly vetted and genuinely trusted, watched them exchange vows that felt real because they were built on honest foundations rather than lies. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity, unmarred by the anxiety and last-minute revelations that had destroyed the first attempt. And when Thomas lifted Claire's veil to kiss her, I saw joy on her face that looked hard-won and genuine, the happiness of someone who'd been through hell and come out stronger on the other side. David served 18 months in prison before being released on parole, his life permanently marked by the felony conviction and the registry of sex offenders he'd landed on due to the nature of his fraud. His career in pharmaceutical sales was over, companies unwilling to hire someone with a fraud conviction. He moved back to Texas after release, reportedly working in retail and trying to rebuild a life that had been destroyed by his own choices and deceptions. Monica divorced him while he was in prison, the proceedings quick and uncontested, both of them eager to permanently sever all legal ties. Whatever David's life became after prison, it would be without the privilege and opportunities he'd squandered through his attempt to commit bigamy. The second before I'd acted in that church vestibule, the moment when the wedding march was playing and everyone was waiting and I had to choose between protecting my daughter and proceeding with ceremony, felt in retrospect like the most important decision of my parenting life. I'd chosen truth over comfort, investigation over trust, my daughter's long-term well-being over the short-term embarrassment of a canceled wedding. The choice had cost us money and social discomfort and had devastated Claire in the immediate term, but it had saved her from a fraudulent marriage that would have eventually been discovered and annulled, from legal complications and the deeper betrayal of finding out after the fact that her husband had committed bigamy. The heartbreaking second of decision had been exactly that. Heartbreaking but necessary, devastating but right. Looking back, I have no regrets about stopping that wedding. The public humiliation was temporary, the financial costs were recoverable, but marrying a man who was committing fraud would have had consequences that extended far beyond what we could have imagined. Claire's life would have been entangled with a criminal, her marriage invalid, her trust destroyed not just in David, but in her own judgment for having missed the signs. By acting immediately when confronted with credible evidence, by prioritizing verification over social expectations, I'd given Claire the chance to rebuild rather than just recover from an even worse betrayal. And in that choice, made in one impossible moment while 300 people waited for a ceremony that would never happen, I'd proven to my daughter that protecting her mattered more than protecting appearances, that truth was worth the cost, even when it destroyed celebrations, and that a father's job is to act when action is hard, not just when it's comfortable. The wedding that didn't happen saved her from the marriage that shouldn't have. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.